June 19, 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese Zero pilots laughed when they first saw intelligence reports about America's new F6F Hellcat fighter, dismissing it as just another clunky American machine that their superior agility and samurai spirit would easily defeat. By the end of that single day, 400 Japanese aircraft lay shattered across the Pacific, while only 29 American planes were lost. A devastating 19-to-1 kill ratio that would forever change the course of the Pacific War. But what did those surviving Japanese pilots discover about American industrial might that their own military leaders had desperately tried to hide from them? The year was 1943, and the Empire of Japan ruled the Pacific like a mighty dragon. From the snowy mountains of Hokkaido to the tropical islands of the South Pacific, the rising sun flag flew over conquered lands. Japanese people believed their nation was blessed by the gods themselves. Their pilots were the finest in the world, trained in the ancient way of Bushido, the warrior's code that valued honor above life itself. In the military bases scattered across the Pacific, young men dreamed of flying the legendary Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighter plane. This aircraft had dominated the skies since the war began. It could turn faster than any enemy plane, climb higher, and fly farther on a single tank of fuel. American pilots feared the Zero's deadly dance in the sky. Japanese newspapers called their aviators samurai of the clouds, and every schoolchild knew their names. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Yamamoto stood on the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Zuikaku, watching the morning sun paint the ocean gold. At 28 years old, he had already shot down 15 enemy planes. His Zero bore the marks of countless battles, yet it still flew like a graceful bird. Yamamoto's flight suit was patched and faded, but his pride burned bright as the rising sun on his helmet. The Japanese economy had been stretched thin by 2 years of constant warfare. Factories worked around the clock to build planes, ships, and weapons. Rice became scarce, and families planted vegetables in their tiny gardens. But the government promised that victory was close. The newspapers showed pictures of captured American territories and defeated British forces. Every sacrifice, they said, brought the empire closer to its rightful place as ruler of Asia. Japanese aircraft design followed a simple philosophy that had served them well. Make the planes light and fast. Every extra pound was the enemy of speed and maneuverability. The Zero weighed just over 5,000 pounds when empty, making it nimble as a hummingbird. Its pilots could outturn any American plane, diving and climbing in spirals that left enemy fighters spinning helplessly. But this lightness came with a price that most pilots never discussed. The Zero had no armor plating to protect its pilot. Its fuel tanks would not seal themselves if punctured by bullets. A single lucky shot could turn the graceful fighter into a falling torch. Japanese military leaders accepted this trade-off. They believed skilled pilots would never be hit, and if they were, dying for the emperor was the highest honor. Young Petty Officer Kenji Tanaka represented the new generation of Japanese pilots. At 19, he had grown up hearing stories of Zero victories over clumsy American planes. His training had lasted only 6 months, much shorter than the 2 years that earlier pilots received. Fuel shortages meant he had flown barely 40 hours before being declared ready for combat. But his instructors filled his head with confidence. American pilots were soft city boys who could not match Japanese warrior spirit. The military command structure in Japan flowed like a sacred river from the emperor down to the lowest soldier. Orders were never questioned. Intelligence reports were filtered through layers of officers who told their superiors only what they wanted to hear. When American industrial capacity began producing new fighter planes, These reports were often dismissed or ignored. The Zero had ruled the sky for 2 years. How could inferior Americans possibly build something better? On this particular morning, Yamamoto reviewed intelligence photographs of a new American fighter called the F6F Hellcat. The pictures showed a stubby, thick-bodied aircraft that looked more like a flying barrel than a graceful fighter. Its wings were short and straight, nothing like the elegant curves of the Zero. The specifications listed a weight nearly twice that of his beloved plane. "Look at this clumsy beast," Yamamoto said to Tanaka, pointing at the photograph. "The Americans build their planes like they build their cars, big and heavy and slow. This thing probably flies like a brick with wings." Tanaka laughed and nodded eagerly. His textbooks had taught him that American pilots lacked the spiritual discipline needed for air combat. They were too comfortable, too spoiled by their easy lives, to develop true warrior hearts. "My instructor said Americans run away when the fighting gets hard, Commander. This ugly plane probably just makes them run away faster." The intelligence report included technical details that should have worried Japanese commanders. The Hellcat carried 6 50-caliber machine guns, compared to the Zero's 2 20-millimeter cannons and 2 machine guns. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that could survive multiple bullet strikes. Heavy armor plating surrounded the pilot's seat and engine. Its Pratt and Whitney engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Zero's power. But these numbers were dismissed as American boasting. Japanese engineers insisted that such heavy protection would make any fighter too slow and clumsy to be effective in combat. The Zero's success had proven that speed and maneuverability mattered more than armor and firepower. Why change a winning formula? As Yamamoto prepared for his morning patrol, he noticed something troubling in the maintenance reports. Replacement parts for the Zeros were becoming harder to find. Mechanics cannibalized damaged planes to keep others flying. New pilots like Tanaka arrived with less training each month as fuel for practice flights grew scarce. But these concerns seemed small compared to the Zero's continued dominance in air-to-air combat. The first radio reports of Hellcat encounters came from pilots returning from missions near American-held islands. They described brief engagements with the new fighters, usually ending with the Japanese pilots withdrawing rather than fighting. These reports were filed away and mostly forgotten. After all, the Zero pilots were simply being cautious, choosing their battles wisely as good tacticians should. But something was changing in the vast Pacific sky, something that would soon shatter every assumption about air warfare that Japan had built its strategy upon. The first real shock came on a cloudy Tuesday morning over the Marshall Islands. Yamamoto led a flight of 8 Zeros toward what intelligence reported as a small group of American bombers with light escort. The mission should have been routine, like dozens of successful raids before. But as they approached the target, Yamamoto's radio crackled with panicked voices from his wingmen. "Bandits at 2 o'clock high. Many bandits." The sky above them swarmed with Hellcats, at least 20 of the stubby American fighters diving down like angry hornets. Yamamoto had never seen so many enemy planes in one place. His Zero formation, which had seemed powerful moments before, now looked pitifully small. The first American fighter roared past Yamamoto's cockpit so fast he barely had time to turn his head. The Hellcat pilot did not try the graceful turning fight that Zeros excelled at. Instead, he dove straight down at tremendous speed, fired a short burst from his 6 heavy machine guns, and kept diving away before any Zero could follow. The burst lasted only 2 seconds, but Yamamoto watched in horror as Petty Officer Sato's plane exploded in a ball of orange flame. "They are not fighting like Americans should fight," Yamamoto radioed to his remaining pilots. American fighters were supposed to be slow and clumsy, easy targets for the Zero's superior turning ability. But these Hellcats refused to turn. They attacked in high-speed passes, using their powerful engines to climb and dive faster than any Zero could match. Within 10 minutes, 5 of Yamamoto's 8 Zeros were burning wrecks falling toward the ocean below. The 3 survivors, including Yamamoto himself, fled toward home base with Hellcats chasing them for 50 miles before finally turning back. Yamamoto had never run from a fight before, but his Zeros simply could not catch the retreating American fighters. Their speed was too great. Back at base, Yamamoto filed his mission report with shaking hands. He described American tactics that seemed impossible. The Hellcat pilots showed no interest in the turning dogfights where Japanese pilots excelled. They used pure speed and overwhelming firepower to destroy targets before disappearing into the clouds. When Yamamoto's commanding officer read the report, he frowned deeply. "You must be mistaken about their numbers, Commander. Intelligence says the Americans have only a few of these new fighters. Perhaps you encountered some kind of special unit." But the reports kept coming from other squadrons. Hellcats were appearing everywhere American forces operated, and they were winning almost every encounter. The few Zero pilots who survived these battles told similar stories. The Americans attacked in large groups, used hit-and-run tactics, and seemed to have unlimited fuel and ammunition. The industrial numbers behind these encounters would have shocked Japanese leaders if they had known the truth. American factories were completing 12,000 Hellcats during 1943 alone. The Grumman factory on Long Island worked 3 shifts every day, with workers sleeping in company dormitories between shifts. New Hellcats rolled off the production line every few hours, painted in navy blue and loaded onto aircraft carriers within days. Meanwhile, Japanese Zero production struggled to build 50 planes per month. The factories lacked raw materials, especially aluminum and high-quality steel. Skilled workers had been drafted into the Army, leaving teenagers and old men to build the complex fighters. Quality control suffered as desperate managers pushed for quantity over precision. American pilot training revealed an even more disturbing contrast. New Hellcat pilots arrived at Pacific bases with over 300 hours of flight time. They had practiced gunnery until they could hit targets in their sleep. Their fuel allowances for training were unlimited, so they flew practice missions every day. Some had flown across the entire United States multiple times just to build experience. Japanese pilots like young Tanaka received barely 40 hours of flight training before being declared ready for combat. Fuel shortages meant they practiced takeoffs and landings, but rarely engaged in air-to-air combat training. Many had never fired their guns at a moving target before their first real battle. The experienced instructors who might have taught them properly were already dead or fighting at the front lines. The maintenance situation grew worse each week. Zero squadrons began cannibalizing parts from damaged aircraft to keep others flying. Engines that should have been replaced after 200 hours of flight time kept running for 400 hours or more. Pilots reported engine failures during combat, leaving them helpless as Hellcats closed in for easy kills. American maintenance crews worked with spare parts shipped directly from factories back home. When a Hellcat engine reached its service limit, mechanics simply bolted in a brand-new replacement. Damaged aircraft were either quickly repaired or replaced entirely with fresh planes from the ever-flowing production line. Yamamoto began keeping a private diary of these encounters, writing by candlelight in his cramped quarters aboard the carrier. His entries grew darker each week. "The Americans are not the soft enemy we were told to expect," he wrote one evening after losing 3 more pilots. "They fight with machines instead of spirit, but their machines are winning." The radio intercepts that Japanese intelligence gathered painted an even more troubling picture. American pilots talked casually about their missions, joking and laughing as if air combat was simply another job. They called encounters with Zeros turkey shoots and complained when they could not find enough Japanese planes to make the missions interesting. "Another boring patrol today," one intercepted American transmission reported. "Only saw 6 Zeros and shot down 4. Need more targets to make this worthwhile." This casual confidence shook Japanese pilots who had been raised to believe that air combat was sacred warfare requiring years of spiritual preparation. The Americans treated shooting down Zeros like target practice, showing none of the reverence for aerial combat that Bushido demanded. As autumn turned to winter, the pattern became undeniable. Every encounter with Hellcats resulted in heavy Japanese losses and minimal American casualties. The kill ratios that intelligence officers reported seemed impossible, but they came from too many sources to doubt. Something fundamental was changing in the Pacific Air War, and Japan was losing badly. June 19, 1944, dawned clear and calm over the Philippine Sea. Yamamoto adjusted his flight goggles and checked his fuel gauge one final time before takeoff. The Japanese fleet had assembled its largest carrier force since the war began. 9 aircraft carriers loaded with over 400 planes. Today would be the decisive battle that would drive the Americans back across the Pacific and restore Japanese control of the seas. The mission briefing had filled every pilot with confidence. Intelligence reported that American carriers near Saipan had fewer than 300 aircraft. Japanese planes would outnumber the enemy for the first time in months. The Zero pilots talked excitedly about finally having enough planes to overwhelm the Hellcats through sheer numbers. Even the newest pilots like Tanaka seemed eager for battle. "Today we show the Americans what happens when they face the full power of the Imperial Navy," Commander Ozawa announced to the assembled air crews. "Every pilot who returns will have helped secure victory for the Emperor." The pilots cheered and bowed deeply, their voices echoing across the flight deck. But as Yamamoto climbed into his Zero's cockpit, doubt gnawed at his stomach like hunger. His plane showed signs of the material shortages plaguing Japanese forces. The engine had been rebuilt twice, using parts salvaged from wrecked aircraft. His radio worked only intermittently. The paint on his wings was faded and patched, making him wonder if American radar operators could spot his plane more easily. The first wave of Japanese attackers launched at dawn, 169 planes flying toward the American fleet. Yamamoto led a group of 40 Zeros assigned to protect the dive bombers and torpedo planes. The formation looked impressive as it stretched across the morning sky, but experienced pilots noticed troubling details. Many of the bomber pilots were teenagers who had never flown in combat before. Some had difficulty maintaining formation during the 3-hour flight to the target. When American radar detected the incoming Japanese strike, the response was swift and overwhelming. Over 200 Hellcats rose to meet them, guided by radio controllers who could track every Japanese plane from dozens of miles away. The American fighters climbed to optimal altitude and positioned themselves perfectly before the first Zero even spotted them. The slaughter began 40 miles from the American fleet. Hellcats dove out of the sun in groups of 6 or 8, their heavy machine guns chattering for brief deadly bursts before zooming away at speeds no Zero could match. Japanese bombers fell like burning leaves, their inexperienced pilots unable to take evasive action quickly enough. The carefully planned attack formation dissolved into chaos within minutes. Yamamoto found himself alone in the sky, his wingmen either dead or scattered. A Hellcat appeared behind him, and he pulled his Zero into the tightest turn possible, using every trick learned in 5 years of combat. The American pilot did not even try to follow the turn. Instead, he climbed away at full power, then dove back down from a different angle for another high-speed attack. The Hellcat's 650 caliber machine guns fired in perfect harmony, sending a stream of half-inch bullets toward Yamamoto's fragile Zero. Most missed, but 3 rounds punched through his right wing, tearing holes the size of dinner plates in the thin aluminum skin. If those bullets had hit his fuel tank or engine, he would have died instantly like so many of his comrades. Fighting desperately to stay alive, Yamamoto realized something that shattered every belief about air warfare he had carried since flight training. The American pilot was not trying to outfly him or demonstrate superior skill. He was simply using his machine's advantages to kill efficiently and safely. The Hellcat's armor protected its pilot from return fire. Its powerful engine allowed attacks from any angle. Its heavy guns could destroy a Zero with a single good burst. "We are not fighting pilots," Yamamoto whispered into his radio as he dove toward the ocean to escape another Hellcat attack. "We are fighting flying tanks." The second and third waves of Japanese attackers suffered even worse losses. American fighter controllers vectored fresh Hellcats toward each incoming raid, ensuring that Japanese planes faced overwhelming opposition at every turn. Radio transmissions from the doomed attackers painted a picture of complete disaster. Entire squadrons vanished without reaching their targets. By afternoon, the ocean was littered with wreckage from Japanese aircraft. American rescue boats pulled dozens of Japanese air crews from the water, but hundreds more had died in their burning planes. The few attackers who reached the American fleet found themselves facing walls of anti-aircraft fire that made survival nearly impossible. Yamamoto's fuel gauge showed almost empty when he finally spotted his home carrier. Of the 40 Zeros in his protection group, only 8 returned. The bomber squadrons they were supposed to protect had been annihilated. As he climbed down from his cockpit, maintenance crews surrounded him with questions about battle damage and enemy tactics. "How many Americans did you shoot down, Commander?" asked a young mechanic whose brother had flown in the first wave. Yamamoto stared at the boy for a long moment before answering, "I did not shoot down any Americans today. I spent the entire battle trying not to die." The mechanic's face fell. But Yamamoto continued speaking as if the words were being pulled from his soul. "The Americans have built a machine that makes our courage worthless. Every Hellcat pilot who climbs into his cockpit becomes our superior, not because he has more skill or braver spirit, but because his airplane is a weapon and ours is a target. We have been sending samurai to fight tanks." The final casualty reports arrived that evening, and they told a story that would haunt Japanese naval aviation forever. Over 400 Japanese aircraft had attacked the American fleet. 29 had returned safely to their carriers. The Americans had lost 29 planes total, most to anti-aircraft fire rather than Japanese fighters. The kill ratio was 19 Japanese planes destroyed for every American loss, a number so catastrophic that staff officers first thought it was a reporting error. But surviving pilots confirmed the terrible mathematics of technological superiority. The F6F Hellcat had not just won a battle. It had demonstrated that Japanese air power was obsolete. In his private diary that night, Yamamoto wrote the words that would define his understanding of modern warfare. "Today, I learned that wars are not won by the most honorable warriors, but by the most practical engineers. The Americans did not defeat our spirit. They made our spirit irrelevant." August 15th, 1945 arrived with Emperor Hirohito's voice crackling through radio speakers across Japan, announcing surrender to a nation that had never known defeat. Yamamoto listened from a hospital bed in Yokosuka. his left leg shattered by Hellcat bullets during his final mission 3 months earlier. The war was over, and Japan lay in ruins beneath American bombers that had flown unopposed through skies once ruled by the Zero. The journey home began on a hospital ship crowded with wounded soldiers and sailors. Yamamoto carried with him more than physical scars from 4 years of combat. Hidden in his personal kit were technical drawings he had sketched of Hellcat wreckage recovered from crashed American planes. These drawings showed construction methods and design principles that Japanese engineers had never imagined possible. The Hellcat's wing structure used techniques that made it incredibly strong while keeping weight reasonable. Its engine cooling system was far more advanced than anything Japan had developed. Most importantly, the aircraft had been designed from the beginning to protect its pilot. With layers of armor plating that could stop machine gun bullets without making the plane too heavy to fly effectively. As the transport ship approached Yokohama Bay, Yamamoto saw his homeland for the first time in 2 years. The coastline that had once been lined with bustling ports and industrial facilities now showed gaps, like missing teeth, where American bombs had found their targets. Smoke still rose from some areas, and the harbor was filled with sunken ships that would take years to clear. The train journey to his family home in Nagoya revealed the true cost of Japan's war against American industrial might. Every major city showed bomb damage that seemed impossible to repair. Factories that had once built Zeros and other warplanes were twisted piles of metal and concrete. The railroad tracks themselves had been repaired so many times that the train moved slowly, lurching over uneven sections that American bombs had destroyed. Yamamoto's wife and 2 young children met him at the station, but they looked nothing like the healthy family he remembered. His wife had lost 30 pounds during the final months of war, when rice became almost impossible to find. His son, now 8 years old, wore clothes patched together from scraps of different fabrics. His daughter asked if he had brought any food from the ship. A question that broke his heart. Walking through his neighborhood, Yamamoto saw how completely the war had changed ordinary Japanese life. Houses had been torn down to create fire breaks after American bombing raids. Victory gardens filled every available space, but the vegetables growing there looked thin and weak in soil exhausted by desperate farming. Old men and women did all the heavy work because most younger adults had died in the war or were still returning from overseas. The contrast with what he knew about American abundance struck him like a physical blow. During his time as a prisoner, after being shot down, he had seen American supply ships unloading endless streams of food, fuel, and equipment. American soldiers ate meals that would feed a Japanese family for days. They threw away items that Japanese civilians would consider precious treasures. In quiet moments during his recovery, Yamamoto began working on a detailed analysis of why Japan had lost the air war so completely. His technical drawings of Hellcat components became the foundation for understanding how Americans had achieved such overwhelming superiority. Every design choice revealed a philosophy that prioritized practical effectiveness over traditional ideas about honor and sacrifice. The Hellcat's self-sealing fuel tanks, for example, cost more to manufacture and added weight to the aircraft, but they kept pilots alive to fight again, which meant experienced air crews could accumulate hundreds of hours of combat time. Japanese pilots died in their first or second battles because their planes offered no protection, creating a deadly cycle where inexperienced replacements faced veteran American pilots. American manufacturing techniques also revealed lessons that Japan had ignored. The Hellcat was designed for mass production, with parts that could be made by semi-skilled workers in factories across the United States. Interchangeable components meant that any Hellcat could be repaired using parts from any other Hellcat. Japan had built each Zero almost by hand, using skilled craftsmen whose methods could not be easily copied or expanded. Local aviation engineers began visiting Yamamoto's small apartment, drawn by rumors that he possessed detailed knowledge of American aircraft design. These meetings, held secretly because occupation authorities discouraged such activities, became the foundation for Japan's post-war aviation industry. The men who attended these gatherings would later design civilian aircraft using principles learned from studying Hellcat wreckage. The Americans won because they understood something we did not, Yamamoto explained to one group of young engineers. They knew that keeping pilots alive was more important than making planes that could turn quickly. They built strength into their machines instead of demanding impossible courage from their men. The psychological impact of losing so completely to supposedly inferior Americans continued to trouble Yamamoto for months after returning home. Japanese military education had taught that spirit and determination could overcome any material disadvantage. The Hellcat's 19-to-1 kill ratio proved this belief catastrophically wrong, but accepting that truth meant questioning everything Japanese society had taught about warfare and national character. In his final diary entry about the war, written 6 months after returning home, Yamamoto captured the transformation that defeat had forced upon him and his generation. We called Americans soft because they built comfortable lives instead of glorifying sacrifice, but their softness was actually wisdom. They used their brains to avoid the suffering we embraced as virtue. The Hellcat pilot who shot me down was not a better warrior than me. He was simply a man whose country gave him better tools. Years later, as Yamamoto helped design Japan's first post-war civilian aircraft, he would tell younger engineers that the greatest lesson of the Pacific War was never to mistake an enemy's different approach for weakness. The F6F Hellcat had taught Japan that practical engineering could defeat spiritual dedication, that protecting your people was more important than testing their courage, and that victory belonged not to those willing to die most readily, but to those smart enough to keep their best people alive. The Hellcat's dominance over the Zero became more than just a military statistic. It became a lesson about the power of combining industrial capacity with intelligent design, a lesson that would guide Japan's remarkable transformation from defeated empire to peaceful industrial giant.